Distinguished speaker and dear participants, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to our very special webinar on the future of U.S.-China relations. To briefly introduce NICE, Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, and conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. China Studies is one of our major research centers. China Studies as a whole brings into perspective the rising powers mounting economic, military, and diplomatic cloud that certainly has the aptitude to either overturn or sustain the current contemporary world order. The center broadly examines China's international strategic thinking and conduct, foreign and security policies, and the impact of domestic politics and economy on China's foreign relations. We have been holding regular interactions on China with experts from around the world. To talk on various very interesting topic of today, we have very distinguished scholar, Dr. Seong-Hyon Lee, Senior Fellow at George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.-China Relations, U.S. Dr. Lee is a visiting scholar at the Harvard University Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies. Previously, he served as director at the Center for Chinese Studies and the Department of Unification Studies at the Sejong Institute, a foreign policy and national security think tank in Seoul. He is the author of U.S. China Competition, Who Will Rule the World, published by Books Garden, and appeared on a lecture series, JTBC Distinguished Class. Dr. Lee is a graduate from Grinnell College, Harvard University, and Tsinghua University. He was a Pantech Fellow at Shorenstein Asia-Pacific Research Center at Stanford University, Salzburg Global Fellow, and James A. Kelly Korean Studies Fellow of the Pacific Forum CSIS. Currently, he is a non-resident senior fellow at Peking University, Center for Korean Peninsula Studies, and Seoul National University's China Center. He is a frequent contributor to scholarly articles in academic journals, including China Report, the Washington Quarterly, Asian Perspective, International Journal of Korean Unification Studies, Journal of Korean Studies, on topics that include the Korean perspective of U.S.-China and China-Korean relations, and China's relation with North Korea. In addition, he has penned numerous policy papers on national security and foreign policy in East Asia. He gave lectures and talks for the Council on Foreign Affairs, Harvard Kennedy School, Stanford University, Rand Corporation, University of Pennsylvania, U.S Indo-Pacific Command, Hudson Institute, and the National Assembly. He provides briefings into South Korean presidential candidate and advise corporations on China, such as Samsung Electronics. Dr. Lee is fluent in Korean, Chinese, and English. He previously served as the 8th U.S. Army Inspector General's office in Seoul. Dr. Lee, once again, welcome to your program. Kindly make your remarks in our 30 minutes maximum, which will be followed by question and answers. The program is streaming live on several Facebook and other social media platforms. We'd like to request all our participants to drop their question on Zoom chat or on the Facebook Live. You can also tweet your questions if you like. Dr. Lee, over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Jaiswal, for your very gracious and very detailed introduction. I don't think I deserve all of the credits, but thank you once again. And also thank you for inviting me for this very interesting discussion. I said the discussion because I'm not necessarily see myself as an expert. I think I'm just a student. I'm also a researcher, just like many of you who are watching this program. So I'll talk for a few minutes and then open up to discussion so that we could engage in more dialogue. I think dialogue is the best way for us to exchange our ideas and learn from each other. And I also want to learn from many of the distinguished audience for today. As you know, I'm from Korea. I'm from South Korea. And it was December 2016 I was attending a conference in China. And at the time, if you remember, that was the time when Donald Trump just got elected as the president of the United States. And that the conference topic suddenly became what could happen in U.S.-China relations after the election of Donald Trump as the president of the United States. And many of Chinese scholars at the time didn't worry very much. Their immediate reaction was that, oh, come on, don't worry about it. Donald Trump is just a businessman. We could do business with him. That was the kind of general reaction. Even though Donald Trump has a big mouth, even though Donald Trump is a person who is tough talking, but at the end of the day, Donald Trump is a businessman, and we could work with Donald Trump by giving him many business incentives to him and also his family members. So they were rather thinking that, underestimating what could happen. And back in Seoul, I was also presenting U.S.-China relations at the time. And the reaction from Seoul was also didn't take the U.S.-China relations very seriously, because there is a golden rule of looking at U.S.-China relations that goes so-called, even though U.S. and China may have some disagreement, but at the end of the day, they need each other economically. So they could shake their hands and settle their differences. This is both are nuclear powers, and they cannot fight each other. They cannot go to war each other, and they have very strong economic ties. So at the end of the day, they will shake their hands and they'll become friends. That was a kind of overall reaction at the time. So Seoul, my country, South Korea, was underestimating at the time what would come to happen in the U.S.-China relations. And also China was also underestimating Donald Trump. But I was not underestimating. Actually, I was a little bit worried, because at the time I told my Chinese colleagues and my friends that, you know what, I watched a documentary film by Peter Navarro, who later became a White House economic chief for Donald Trump. Before he worked with Donald Trump, Peter Navarro produced a documentary film, Death by China. And it was a very negative portrayal of how Americans feel about China. But the point is that Peter Navarro did not just interview Donald Trump. Donald Trump was there in the documentary, but he also interviewed many policymakers, both Republicans and also Democrats, including Kurt Campbell, who is now at the White House dealing with these China affairs. He interviewed many mainstream American scholars, former officials, both Republicans and Democrats, also journalists who dealt with China. And the whole documentary overall was pretty negative portrayal of how Americans feel about China. So my sense at the time, after analyzing this documentary and the kind of people who showed up in this documentary, also many other emerging signs, I told the Chinese that there was no reason for China to underestimate Donald Trump and how tough he could be toward China. And then I went to Washington later, and they told me that we thank Xi Jinping because Xi Jinping talked about the Chinese dream to overtake United States. That's how we got to know that China has this aspiration, this this dream to surpass this, outstrip United States. Now we clearly see that China has this ambition to challenge the United States. So that's why we are widely waken up to the reality, and we are ready to tackle the Chinese challenge more seriously than before. So that was a perspective from America. So what I'm sharing, this anecdotal stories is that how overall, initially, what many of us thought could happen or underestimated the kind of challenge that is unfolding today was not really seen as a challenge initially, but later it became bigger, and more seriously. It started as in 2018 as a trade dispute. The U.S. State Department even did not allow its U.S. diplomats to use the terminology trade war. They instructed their diplomats to use the terminology trade tension, not trade war, not trade dispute either, because they don't want to shape, using their language in the relationship in such a negative way. But then, as we witnessed, the relationship got deteriorated and also expanded from trade to territorial disputes in South China Sea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang Uyghur, human rights, democracy, values, in all sectors that was started from trade dispute. So I think it gives a challenge and also insight for analysts and scholars like us to how we should be careful about not preemptively conclude this, something that could happen, and it could happen much more seriously, evolve into a much bigger problem. Having said that, come to the fast forward to today, my assessment is that China today, under the Biden administration of the United States, sees United States as a declining power. I have been monitoring the Chinese perception for the last several years, and I have no reason to change my judgment. China still considers United States under Joe Biden a declining superpower. And even the Biden's Chinese nickname, Biden actually has a Chinese nickname that is Bai Zhenhua. What that means is that, Biden, Bai means Biden's Bai, Zhenhua means revitalize China. So what that means is that Biden is a person who helps to revitalize the rise of China. That is the Chinese nickname of President Biden. So they still see United States under China as a continually declining power after 4 years of democratic decay under Trump. And Biden's task is, China thinks that it's a huge challenge just to clean up all the mess created by Donald Trump. And it'll probably take the entire 4 years to clean up the mess created by Biden. And as you know, in November, in 2 months from now, there will be midterm elections. Probably, it's possible that Republicans will take over the Senate. And probably 2 years from now, Republican president will take back the White House. And probably Trump might come back and take the White House again and become president again. So China sees this whole big picture, the trend of how American politics, American society is doing in these years. America is suffering from, as you saw, the struggle in January 6th last year at the Capitol Hill. The mobs took over the Capitol Hill, continuing democratic decay, racial discrimination problems, the immigration issues that we are seeing these days, the inflation, the highest inflation for the last 40 years, and the political divide, and the problem of dealing with China, also Russia over Ukraine issue. The United States has to deal with not just China, but Russia, two big powers, also has to deal with the very sensitive Taiwan issue, while the economy is declining. So China sees that this, as Xi Jinping repeatedly said, this is a once in a 100-year opportunity. He didn't exactly say this as an opportunity. He said that this is a once in a 100-year a shift, a change. But the connotation is that it's an opportunity. China sees that in a continuing rivalry between US and China, the ongoing struggle with the United States, they see both risk and opportunity, but sense of opportunity, that this is an opportunity for China to become #1 superpower, is still there. So China is moving with this sense of, heroic sense of returning to what they call its due place in the world. China took over Japan in 2010 to become the #2 economy in the world. China is now it's #2, and there is only one more to go, and that is to take over the United States. And I think that there are many narratives that, oh, China does not have such an ambition. But if you look at it the other way around, at the end of last year, China's GDP, after 2 years of a pandemic period, China's GDP caught up with the United States nearly at the level of 78%. So China is 78% of American economy. China is #2 military as well. And China is now #1 exporter in the world. And China it has become the #1 trading partner with more than 100 countries in the world. So why not? Why not China couldn't have that ambition to become #1 when China has become such a big superpower? And China is also under a very ambitious, driven leader called Xi Jinping. So in a way that instead of saying US and China are, oh, it's not going to happen, the kind of conflict that the media is portraying, oh, that's not going to happen. That's a politically correct statement. But if you look at the reality, and if you look at the progress that China has made so far for the last 40 years of U.S.-China relations and how China's power has been continuing to rise almost to the level that now it is only natural, in a way, for China to have an ambition to, oh, gee, I want to become #1, just like during the Qing dynasty, when I was #1. I think this could be seen also as a natural process when you look at the world history and how different countries showed up and challenged the seating power in the world. So I'm not necessarily here to display or argue a inevitable conflict, but on the other hand, if you look at it from more realistic angle, and if you look at it from the historical angle, there is a more chance that the China-US relations will continue to deteriorate, continue to worsen for the foreseeable future. And we are at the timing of discussing whether Xi Jinping will get his 3rd term. From my perspective, Xi Jinping's 3rd term is no problem. About 3 weeks ago, the Chinese government announced they're going to have the 20th Party Congress in October 16th. And interestingly, if you look at it very carefully, the way the announcement was written, in the previous occasions for the Party Congress, usually they first state that we are going to have a Party Congress at such and such date. And then they, write down all the achievements of the previous government. But this time, if you look at the announcement for the 20th Party Congress, actually what they wrote was what is going to be the policy in the next 5 years. This is very interesting. And it narrated 2 things. That is, one is common prosperity. And number 2, shared common destiny. And if you remember, common prosperity is Xi Jinping's slogan, Xi Jinping's policy, and shared community of humanity is also a slogan by Xi Jinping. And the announcement said that this is going to be the policy in the next 5 years. Yeah, that will be, they're going to discuss. So it hints in a very unambiguous manner that Xi Jinping will surely get his 3rd term, and there is no meaningful rival to stand up to Xi Jinping. And the common discussion about the factional disputes among different political factions in China, my observation is that those competition among different factions, such as Shanghai, or other Taizidang or other meaningful or Gongqingtuan, this kind of factional disputes, they already made a compromise, and so Xi Jinping is okay to go. So in the 3rd term of Xi Jinping, my expectation is that in the area of politics, Xi Jinping will strengthen the governance by CPC, the governance by Chinese Communist Party in all sectors of Chinese society and politics, East, West, South, North. When it comes to economy, Xi Jinping will continue to unfold dual circulation to strengthen domestic sector of economy. When it comes to society, Xi Jinping will continue to implement common prosperity. When it comes to foreign policy, Xi Jinping will continue to do new type of major international relations, plus new type of neighborly diplomatic relations to strengthen China's ties with immediate close neighbors, such as Korean Peninsula, India, Russia, Mongolia, Thailand, Nepal, in these Asian countries. When it comes to Taiwan, Xi Jinping will be much more determined and pay attention to the unification with Taiwan. What I just said is that what Xi Jinping has been pursuing so far. So what that means is that there will be a more continuity rather than change in the foreseeable future under the third term of Xi Jinping. When it comes to U.S.-China relations, there will be more conflict than cooperation. And I'll stop here and engage in discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Seong-Hyon Lee. Thank you for the comprehensive and enlightening presentation. You have touched upon a wide range of issues, and we have received lots of questions under the periphery of those issues that you have raised. So without any delay, let me share them with you. The first question is, how is Indo-Pacific strategy and Quad going to impact U.S.-China relations?
Indo-Pacific strategy and Quad, right?
Yes, like how Quad and Indo-Pacific strategy will impact the relation of two countries.
I think if you remember, Dr. Jaiswal, it was not called Indo-Pacific, it was called the Asia-Pacific strategy. And the US government, US military changed it into Indo-Pacific. So what that means is that Southeast Asia, ASEAN countries, and South Asia in general will become the center stage of US-China rivalry, including over Taiwan. And US will use tools to contain China in the region. And these tools are called Indo-Pacific strategy that you mentioned, also Quad, and also Indo-Pacific economic framework that just got started, and also AUKUS that you did not mention, but it is emerging. So US is unfolding and making preparations step by step, networking closely with the countries in the region to strengthen teamwork and League of Nations to confront China. And I think, as you mentioned, Indo-Pacific strategy and Quad will be a continuing central feature in US hedging, dealing, confronting, maintaining supremacy in the region vis-a-vis China.
Thank you. Let me move to the next question. Like, how do you look at United States, Tibet and Taiwan policy? What are the continuation and what are the changes?
Taiwan policy, as you remember, just yesterday, President Joe Biden made a statement that in case of a conflict over the Taiwan Strait, U.S. would send its troops to defend Taiwan. That was the most clearest signal the U.S. government has articulated when it comes to how U.S. would respond in case there is a conflict over Taiwan. As we all know, Taiwan is not a pact military ally of the United States. Taiwan is not Australia. It's not official ally. Taiwan is not Japan. But there has been, over the last 1 year or so, the President of the United States has been actually ramping up his, not just his words, but also the level of commitment over Taiwan. And I think that given what I just previously said, that the Central South Asia and the Southeast Asia will be the center of the competition between US and China rivalry, and also combined with the Indo-Pacific strategy and Quad issue that you just mentioned. I think if US loses Taiwan, that would tantamount to US losing the Indo-Pacific strategy. So I think US commitment with Taiwan will become stronger and stronger. That is my assessment.
There is, like you just talked about, said about Taiwan, and you said that Biden was very clear on sending the message. But do you see the possibility of a small-scale war or conflict between the US and China over Taiwan or South China Sea? Do you see the conflict coming up, or do you think that both the countries will be able to tone down and resolve the differences?
Thank you for raising this question, Dr. Jaiswal. Isn't it this the most concern that Washington is worried about? Also, Beijing is also worried about. Actually, we, the audience, is also worried about, because there is tremendous uncertainty when there is accidental, small, regional conflict that might get out of control. So far, both Washington and Beijing have been very careful, even though there are have been some skirmishes. But overall, my assessment is that they have been very careful to prevent such a kind of an accidental collision from happening. For example, China, before the visit of Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan, vehemently protested and even threatened militarily, but they didn't do anything during Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. Only after Pelosi left Taiwan, they began the huge, large-scale military drills surrounding Taiwan. So, if you look at this behavior, and also there was some communication, emergency consultation on the way during the Pelosi visit to Taiwan between the two militaries, between US and China. But how long that kind of crisis management system will work? What if there is a miscommunication, misjudgment, and sometimes, China, I know from my own experience, when China gets really upset, one of the signature foreign policy behavior of China is that to cut off all the communication channels with a certain country that it has a disagreement with. So what if China cuts off all the communication channels? and then there is a crisis, and then both sides, misjudge the situation. So I think this is a time where the more we see a tension, possibility of accidental collision, I think we should, the international community, make sure that, including UN and other concerned countries, make sure that there are open communication of channels to manage the crisis.
We have received lots of questions within this periphery. Like there's another question that, is there a possibility that Biden will be able to re-navigate the United States democratic decay under his terms? If so, how is it going to affect its allies on the Indo-Pacific region or Asia-Pacific region, given that China is also in the midst of establishing ties with the region? That is one. Second is that, what could be China's strategy to counter the Quad's influence in the region?
Let me tackle the second question first. China knows what US is doing to contain China. That is networking with partner countries, strengthening alliance system. And China has learned from US strategy. So China is also networking, strengthening its own allies or semi-allies like Pakistan, North Korea, and partners like Russia. Also reaching out to South Asian countries that many of you are here now listening to. Before the pandemic began, the last country Xi Jinping visited was Myanmar. After the pandemic, we are still at the recovery stage, but just recently, the first country Xi Jinping visited was Central Asia to attend the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So US is strengthening its network of friends and partners, and China is also doing the same thing, imitating US strategy. So it'll be very interesting to watch how, how should I say, team of rivals, strengthening their own, not just their own power, but also their team's power. But then the caveat and also concern is that, this might become more and more resemble the situation during the Cold War. Because during the Cold War, US, Japan, and these Western powers and democracies teamed together against communist blocs of China, North Korea, Soviet Union. Those demarcations and the differentiations, this separation of the global politics was the feature of Cold War. So that's why many scholars, including us, we are suspecting that this is not exactly a new Cold War, probably not, but then it resembles many primary features of the Cold War. So we should be very careful. And this warning is coming from a renowned scholar like Henry Kissinger. What was your first question?
The first question was, is there a possibility that Biden will be able to re-navigate US democratic decay under his term?
Oh, okay. I think I don't want to be pessimistic. I don't want to prejudge what will happen in the United States. I'm sure, number one, America is a very interesting country. There is a tremendous internal resilience. It has a tremendous ability for self-examination, self-scrutiny, and self-recovery. The situation that we see right now is worrisome. But during my conversation with American scholars, they told me that how the situation was even much, much worse during the 1960s when there was a civil disputes and protest, and in many American university and colleges, there was protest against the Vietnam War. Even students got killed during the protest, and the situation was much, much worse. So those older scholars who experienced this 50 years ago, and now comparing it the situation today in the United States, they think that, oh, this is something that we could manage. So we'll see what happens. I think the chance is, there are still chances that America could recover. And secondly, during these 2 years of a pandemic, where the US has been particularly focusing on preventing China from obtaining computer chips, semiconductors, US effort has been reportedly at least quite successful so far. And at least the future competition between US and China, one of the primary features is the semiconductor war. And US has been preventing China from obtaining most advanced semiconductors that will be used for artificial intelligence, big data, and space weapons and satellites, future military weapons, all kinds of electric devices, most advanced data centers. Through this effort, there was an assessment in Washington, D.C. that initially U.S. think tank, such as briefings, assessed that by the year 2027, China might be able to catch up with the United States, at least in terms of economy. But the timeline has been postponed to 2035, thanks to the U.S. effort to prevent China from having access to the semiconductors and other measures that U.S. has been trying to contain China. So we'll see what happens. And there is no reason for us to underestimate U.S. ability, American ability to self-recovery and the American resilience. I think there is a tremendous potential in the United States to be back to where it was. But I think that the reality is something that scholars need to continue to make an assessment as things change.
Thank you. You just mentioned about Russia and the communist Russia. So how is Ukraine crisis and Russia-China ties going to impact U.S.-China relations?
There was a concern that China in Washington, China was learning a lot from Russian invasion of Ukraine. It teaches a lot of lessons because China is also thinking about unifying Taiwan. And one of the fear was that as time prolongs, initially what many observers thought would be a very quick war on Ukraine actually becomes a protracted, long war without any clear winner at this moment. So there was a concern in Washington, D.C. that China might have been learning that we need to have a very decisive initial all-out military campaign against Taiwan so that we could have a very quick victory, unlike what is happening on Ukraine. The more we prolong our time, the more uncertainty will happen, just like what we are witnessing in Ukraine situation. And the more time passes, the US military will have time to come to rescue Taiwan, just like what Biden said a couple of days ago. So that was a lesson and also concern that US fears that China is learning from the war on the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Thank you. You just mentioned about Russia and China. Let's move to India. How would a growing India-US relationship affect China's behavior towards India?
You are asking a lot of difficult questions today. But I think when it comes to China's strategy toward India is that China will continue to leave the border dispute with India unresolved because it's a useful leverage for China to shape India's behavior. China and India borders, huge borders, very long borders. And the US is, India is a member of Quad. And the US and India has been seeing deepening their cooperation these days. So China fears that, they should not let the situation go on like this. So it's interesting that instead of giving an olive branch to India to shape India's behavior, actually China will do that because China can use both carrots and sticks. But when it comes to border issues, China will continue to use the border issues, leave it unresolved, so China can use it against India as a political leverage. At the same time, if you look at the landscape geography, the river flows from the dams and rivers. They are more upstream from China, and it flows down to India. There is also a possibility that China will also use its dam and water resources or turn the direction of the river and use it as another pressure to the India. China could also use its relationship with Pakistan, also Bangladesh, to shape India. But then China will not go all the way to antagonize India so that India will fully commit to joining the Team USA, because China knows that India is also another superpower rising over there, huge military, huge population, also nuclear weapons power.
There's another question which is asked by our scholar. Do you agree with Graham Ellison's prediction on the future of US-China relations? As I know, Graham Ellison has predicted the outbreak of conflict between these two states by applying a Theseus trap in his book, Destined for War.
Graham Ellison, he once said in one of the conferences that actually he did not like the title of the book, but the publisher decided on that book because in that way the book will sell very well. So he had his own concern, but I'm not sure whether he is unhappy with the title of the book either, because I'm sure he will be more like happy watching his books became a bestseller. And after the book came published, it also got translated even in Korean language. It became a bestseller. So I'm sure he is happy. Also, the Chinese leadership, Zhong Nanhai, Wang Jisan invited Graham Ellison over to Beijing and a lot of red carpet treatment, a lot of conferences over there. So what I'm implying here is that intentions could be subtle, complex. You say one thing, but actually you don't want that. That's why I think that this is a time that we need to really control the narrative. We need to really able to manage manage the perceptions and misunderstandings and signals, diplomatic signals that U.S. is sending to China. China might perceive the U.S. has a military strategy to contain China, or China might send wrong signal to the United States that China intends to really militarily take over Taiwan in the coming 1.5 years. It used to be like by 2027, 100th anniversary of PLA. But now in Washington there is a new timeline that China might do that by in the next 1.5 years. When you are faced with these very narratives, and then you don't fact checking or you don't communicate each other, these kind of narratives and perspective and might turn out to be a wishful thinking and might turn out to be a reality. So that's why we gotta be very careful. In theory, between the number one nuclear power and number two superpower in the world, the kind of military crisis is unlikely, and they are both working very hard to prevent it. But I don't think it's a 100% guarantee. And I don't think it's a 100% guarantee that there will not be, we cannot say that there will not be a military clash between the US and China. And by beginning from that realistic perspective, actually, I think we have a better chance to prevent the war.
Thank you. Let me move to other question which has been shared by our scholars. Like China has agreed to the freedom of access to sea and navigation in South China Sea, but does not support the presence of US in this area. How does China intend to resolve the South China Sea dispute? That is one. Second is, do you see overlap between Trump's administration's Indo-Pacific strategy and Biden administration's pivot to Asia? What are those similarities?
When it comes to the South China Sea issues, China's foreign policy approach has been quite consistent. That is to deal with the countries individually, not as a group. It's part of the time-old Chinese foreign policy strategy, tracing back to the art of war 2,000 years going back in time, because China knows that dealing with ASEAN as a group is more formidable, it's more challenging. But if you deal with one by one each country has a different motivations, different desires, different in a sense that different national interest. So China wants to pursue negotiations with each and single countries in South China Sea in a way to divide the unity of ASEAN, in a sense that this is not to blame China, but from strategic perspective, from a third person's perspective, I think this is a smart strategy. And I think China has been partially succeeding in dividing the ASEAN unity. We can look at it in many cases. Comparing Trump with the Biden, I think Biden at the end of the day essentially has been pursuing the same philosophical approach in dealing with the China, but only more smarter than Trump's strategy.
Okay. There's another question like, has the US withdrawal from Afghanistan created a power vacuum for China? Do you see that China can benefit from that power vacuum?
I think there is definitely power vacuum to be filled. But at the same time, that from US strategy perspective, by devoting military resources from Afghanistan to the Indo-Pacific, I think they want to pick and choose and focus in the Indo-Pacific strategy. It's just similar to the 2010-2011 US strategy pivot to Asia by diverting 60% of US Navy and Air Force powers from the Middle East to, at the time, didn't call Indo-Pacific, but Asia-Pacific. So I think that there is a cost-benefit analysis to be done. And but I think the US has been rather consistent in terms of strengthening it and mounting up its focus to the Indo-Pacific area. And of course, there is a power vacuum, and of course there is a blame the way that America troops hurriedly left Afghanistan, and there was a humanitarian crisis that was well reported. And there is also the power vacuum will be seen as an opportunity for China, and also at the same time, to a certain degree, to Russia, because if you remember the Afghanistan crisis during the late 1970s. So I think superpowers during this big rivalry between China and the United States, they will relocate their troops, their networking, their friends, who they want to become friends with, who they want to protect, who they want to strengthen, who they don't want to be very close. They will do a lot of opportunity cost-benefit analysis. So this is a very uncertain period in international relations as a whole.
We are running out of time, so let me club last two questions. First is that how far middle powers like Quad members specifically can play the crucial role in managing US-China competition? That is one. And last is, can China overcome United States of America to become #1 in the world? Will we be able to see China-led world order? If yes, then what will be the fate of other major power? And if no, then why?
I think the other major power, let me interpret it as other significant middle powers, right? Yeah, significant middle powers. I think that all countries who are standing in the middle between US-China conflict, or countries who are stuck in the middle in that conflict, just like a shrimp, we Koreans love to use this expression, shrimp stuck between two huge whales. That's the expression that we Koreans use. But I think that the already emerging and continue to evolve, a significant trend is that it's idealistic to think that middle powers could play a significant role to modify the superpowers' behavior. Rather, I'm a more realist, and I see that it's the other way around. More countries that are standing in the middle, stuck in the middle, they will be pressured. They will be pressured to choose a side, period. That's the reality. And the only way to upset this trend is for middle powers to network each other. And given the diverging national interest of these diverse countries who are stuck in the middle, it will be quite challenging for these middle powers and other medium-sized and small countries to unite together and telling a unified message to both China and the United States. Hello, Washington. Hello, Beijing. We want peace. We want to calm down in a peaceful world. I think that is what we hope to, and what we hope to make an effort, including the international organizations like the United Nations. But at the same time, there is a huge challenge in pursuing that idealistic approach. Whether China stands a chance to take over the United States? Of course, the answer is uncertain. Who knows? It's like betting. You are at the stock market. Whether which stock you are betting, Chinese stock or American stock. But then I think that, as you mentioned, the U.S. As you posed the question, the U.S. has a very strong capacity for resilience. They have been showing time and time again to recover from domestic turmoils and domestic political disarray. So there, we should not underestimate U.S. Resilience. At the same time, from Chinese strategic perspective, China sees a long-term perspective. China thinks that competition with the United States is not 1 or 2 years of a competition, but Xi Jinping set out that Chinese dream, the deadline to be accomplished is the year 2049, the 100-year centennial anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. That is about 30 years from now. So China is a long-term strategist. So they see that there will be some setbacks, there will be ups and downs, but I think China is determined. China is determined, particularly under the strongman leader called Xi Jinping. So how Chinese politics, particularly the elite politics, Chinese leadership unfolds, how long Xi Jinping will be in power, whether Xi Jinping will be replaced by a more moderate leader in the future, who knows? So there is an uncertainty in the future. And I'm sorry that I cannot give the clear answer because I don't know the answer.
It was really interesting, sir. Dr. Seong-Hyon Lee, thank you so much for a very interesting discussion. We really learned a lot and we are grateful for your time. I'm sure our audience immensely benefited from it. I, on behalf of NICE and all our audience, would like to thank you for your kind presence and valuable time. We hope to have you in Kathmandu, maybe in real in future. We'd also like to thank all our audience for their wonderful questions. Thank you. Good night.
And also thank you, Dr. Jaiswal, and all the audience and scholars that I want to say hello and meet with you in some of the conferences in the future in person. Thank you so much. I have to listen to more of your insight. I know there are quite qualified, many of qualified audiences here. I have to learn from you, and I hope to have such an opportunity in the future, including Dr. Jaiswal. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Have a nice day. Bye.
Thank you.